Welcome to Talking Roadmaps, the channel where we talk about everything road mapping, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today, I'm joined by Rob Phaal. Rob, can you introduce yourself?
I'm Rob Phaal. For the last 25 years, I've been working at the University of Cambridge in the Department of Engineering with an interest in management tools from an engineering perspective, working mostly with technology-intensive companies, and road mapping is a particular tool of interest.
Yeah, and I know I've come across your courses and your books, so it's interesting to find a different school of thought, different perspective to kind of share with our audience. If you're enjoying the channel, subscribe, hit the bell, and give us a like. What's the purpose of a roadmap?
Well, in one word, alignment around strategy, really. The way I like to think of it now as an analogy is it's the picture on the jigsaw puzzle box. So everyone's got a piece of the jigsaw, and they'll know their piece well, maybe not be aware of other pieces. They probably overinflate the size of their piece, but it's pretty hard to put the jigsaw puzzle together if you don't have that picture on the box. And that's really its role. So alignment of all stakeholders around your strategic purpose so they can understand how their contribution fits into the whole.
So if we're aligning people, who's the audience that's looking at then? Who are we aligning?
Well, that's a really important issue, because I think often if there's confusion about the purpose of a particular roadmap, it starts to get muddied, because one master roadmap, the complete picture, if you like, will have many different audiences, but they'll be emphasizing different aspects. So, for example, the roadmaps I most commonly work with come in manufacturing sector, and they're pretty complex because you have to be organized around that complex engineered product to develop the strategy, but also to implement it. But I've seen many failures where that roadmap is taken to the board. It's the wrong format. They want to show the big picture and show them the money, for example. So you need to think very carefully of all the stakeholders involved, but then what is the purpose and the audience for a particular roadmap visual? It could be for suppliers. It could be for the technical community, product managers, marketing. The way I think of that often is it's a bit like design for X, but the X is before the word roadmap. So if it's a technology roadmap, the focus is technology in the wider system. If it's a product, the same, could be supply chain or whatever. It's a very flexible technique, but you need to be pretty clear about that. Otherwise, you'll tend to have a sort of a vanilla roadmap that doesn't quite meet anyone's needs.
Totally agree. So true. And, it's interesting hearing very much the same thoughts as I hear from product management people coming from this other community there. So it's maybe we've all come to the same point through different paths.
I'm sure. The origins of road mapping go way back, actually, to the earliest ones we've spotted are from the 1960s. Lockheed Martin, NASA, basically very complex engineered products such as aerospace, semiconductors, energy systems. And it was originally focused on the product, but it's such complex technologies that they would have a heavy emphasis on both the product and technology. In agile software, because it's moving so fast, often roadmaps focus really on the product and the feature set, and then people, the commercial or the technical people, will be able to take that away and work on their parts. But in the manufacturing world, often they combine all of those components into one holistic view of the whole strategy. And so I think the general needs are the same, but what you see in hardware environments is often a much more complex picture than you would typically see in an agile software system. So the architecture that is embedded in the product is visible in the roadmap. I haven't really seen that in agile. They're looking at the outputs, if you like, what you can promise to the customers, and that's fine. That's the prime integrator. Everyone can take that away. But I've never seen really, apart from enterprise architecture, maybe applications, these very complex systems, lots of legacy issues. There you see much more explicit architecture in the roadmap structures. So that's perhaps the key difference. But in the end, everyone's trying to get alignment around strategic purpose.
And yeah, I think you started hinting at some of the visuals that I've seen in some of your literature of kind of almost three swim lanes, three layers of those different audience of technology, product and service, and business and markets. Can you maybe tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, so one of the puzzles we had when we spotted road mapping in industry was we thought there's a lot more power in the technique. And what we could do is look at that variety and find new applications. And through that, we've established what we think is the generic form, a universal framework. And that does have three broad perspectives, often represented as layers. And so the focal system is in the middle. But typically above that, you'd have the demand side on the system. And below that, the supply side. And that's really handy if you want to really integrate your entire business from your resources to your end purpose. The product is a stepping stone, but why is it important, and how are you going to develop it? That's typically what you see in that. We always relate those three layers to knowledge types. Why at the top? Why do we need to act? What's driving us? What's motivating us? What do we seek as outputs? What is the product and service, their functionality, performance, features? And then how is technology often, different disciplines, and then other resources. And then set against that is when, the timeline. So 4 of the 6 fundamental dimensions of knowledge are baked into the structure of those roadmaps. The other 2 questions, the who and the where, are not as explicitly represented, but absolutely critical because, in the end, the roadmap has to have ownership, the different layers and perspectives linked to different functions in the business. The objects on the roadmap need ownership. Who's managing that project, who's responsible. The whole roadmap, by the way, you need ownership from the very top. And the most interesting objects on the roadmaps, which aren't that visual often, are the connections and linkages and dependencies. I remember Motorola, who was very influential in the 1980s and 90s in road mapping. They did have some software, and I was talking to somebody in the Chicago research labs, and they said that if I was managing a technology program and I wanted to link to a product development program, I would try to create the link in the software, but the link can't be made until the other side accepts that we have a dependency, and then I know who to call. So the best way to think of a roadmap is not as a data artifact, but as a social contract, if you like. The common aspirations and commitments. And some of those links can be social contracts or real contracts to suppliers and so on. And so I think that the most important layer, the social perspective on road mapping, is the most critical one. And often people don't see it because they just see the object, the artifact produced. And then they file it away. They need to actively use it all the time and to support conversations and insights amongst the stakeholders that those objects represent.
And so that kind of contract, the almost kind of ecosystem between the different kind of elements on the roadmap that are kind of inputs and outputs to each other. Love it. And you started to hint at ownership. So you said ownership at the top. Is there different ownership at some of those different layers, different levels? Is that, who owns this thing? Who kind of maintains it?
Well, often in any substantial initiative, somebody will be delegated with the operational aspects of maintaining it, running around. That's a delegated responsibility. That person normally doesn't own the content of the roadmap, but it does need some care and attention to get the process working. But in terms of what the roadmap represents, then the ownership goes straight to people with responsibilities and where budgets lie. And if you don't get that, it's just an interesting thing to look at. But when you get those people's fingerprints on it and they're committed to those actions that are represented on the roadmap, then you have something phenomenally powerful. Some of the best ones I've seen don't look great, but they're on the wall all the time, very confidential, of course. And so if you get to the point where people naturally gravitate to that visual object when they have a strategic discussion, then you're really flying, I think. And that's what you see in a Scrum or in the sort of manufacturing. There's something I've seen in Scandinavia called lean innovation, which is pretty much the same. Came out of factories, though. If you go into a factory, you'll see visual management boards. The principle is if you can't see it, you can't manage it. And I've seen people take those principles out into the program management, basically product and management area, and they'll have a room dedicated to having these conversations on different clock speeds. And maybe the roadmap will be pulled out every month or two, if you like. And they're just focusing on those conversations. They don't really when I've seen one operate in Stockholm, they were really anti having any complex technology in that room, and software in particular. They were really worried it would suppress the conversations. So they had whiteboards, post-it notes, magnets. They did have a couple of bits of sophisticated technology in the room. They had an atomic clock on the wall because they were very disciplined about time. And they had a high-definition video conferencing system to connect up to other sites around the world, which was about 50,000 people. So a very simple visual management room can scale. And I'd like to see more of that kind of approach. There's a great tendency to get in the software and it's a bit out of sight, out of mind. People might type and not talk. And that's kind of heading in a suboptimal direction, I think.
Yeah, funny enough, I was talking to a senior product person I coached the other day and suggesting that they create a design wall, kind of all the different design artifacts and kind of things like user journeys and so on, and kind of get it physically on the wall. Because sadly, if it's, I love tools like Miriam and Mural, but I can't just walk past them and kind of let that information soak in and kind of almost be informed by just being in its presence.
And interestingly, since I've seen those systems operate at scale and very effectively, I've always mentioned it to people as a potential route for deployment. And usually the response is, we don't have any space. So I always say, well, is your strategy worth less than paint? Because you seem to have a lot of walls. But it's meeting rooms, right? It's they're always under huge demand. I think in the future, touch screens and displays are getting cheap enough that you'll be able to turn on your digital, walls in your meeting room and then have it as a multi-purpose, and that'll solve that problem. Because even things like Miro, you could have a massive screen and still get the social interaction around it rather than a paper system, which is pretty crude. On the other hand, there's no learning curve. Everyone knows how to use Post-it notes, and the worst can happen is a Post-it note falls on the floor. In fact, this system I saw, it's called a pulse room. Every week they had a Perspex box in the middle because it was on the main route into their program office, and Post-it notes would fall down, and they'd pop it in the Perspex box and sort it back out every time.
Yeah, it's I'm always using stickies to kind of think, even just on my own here. And I mean, I have a large whiteboard in my own home office. Because that analog just works. But yeah, it's an interesting thing of kind of maybe in the future having that digital sharing, but in a physical environment.
I mean, it's a remarkable technology, Post-it notes, for having conversations. If you empower people to contribute their ideas with Post-it notes in a light process, organizing the conversation around a structured template, it's amazing how effective it can be. And quite often people have reported that that there's a lot of conflict in these conversations inherently, information asymmetries that cause conflict, and you're always having conversations across these boundaries in these workshops and processes. But I've never really seen conflict because it's purely a communication problem that manifests as conflict. And then people don't want to, you get technical groups and product groups not talking to each other, or they have separate roadmaps. The why, what, how integrated view is bringing it all together. And that has to be owned by the person who's responsible for that part of the business. And they have the power to mediate those conversations and get people in the room. And if they have a good experience, I found then the appetite is massive, to continue. It builds trust, and mutual understanding and appreciation of the other perspectives.
And I think at the root of part of what you said there is an understanding that conflict doesn't have to be a negative thing in reality. So you're not seeing the conflict because you're seeing the discussion that gets to good outcomes. And that's, I guess you could term it as positive conflict. It's disagreeing to get to somewhere, as opposed to fighting between people.
Yeah, there's always trade-offs and compromises, but that needs to be had in an adult sort of conversation, and which is really facilitated by these techniques. So you don't often get sucked down different rabbit holes. Everyone's in their room because they have a important perspective, and these techniques can help them have equal airtime, if you like, without personalities, dominating the conversation, in my experience.
So we've talked about it being owned by some fairly senior people because they own the budgets, this sort of thing. That suggests it might have a link into things like vision and strategy and objectives. How do we relate these things together?
Absolutely. I mean, it depends on what part of the system you're focusing on the roadmap. So whatever the boundaries of that initiative is, that's the whole system you're looking at. It'll have dependencies out to other systems and so on, but it's a very scalable technique. So for any roadmap at any level in the organization, could be a corporate roadmap or sector level roadmap at the top, business unit, product family, down to components and so on. Each one will have its own vision. And that's a problem I see in many firms. The company has a vision, but people can't relate it to their perspective. The systems thinking behind road mapping allows the high level vision to be constructed. So if I'm in charge of, say, materials technology, what's the materials technology vision? It must be a subcomponent of the corporate vision, but that's often not well articulated. And the road mapping helps that organization of information. So the right-hand side of the roadmap, the direction of travel is a fundamental building block. Because without that, it's all, well, how do you know what you're doing today makes sense without some anchor point in the future? Are we heading in the right rough direction? And that's really the purpose of the vision, I think, is direction setting. It may be aspirational. It's beyond the time frame of the roadmap often. Maybe like zero carbon might be a good vision. But in the time frame of your roadmap, say in 5 or 10 years, maybe you can reduce carbon by 50%. That would be the objective. So that pair of data points on the right-hand side, I always think of as the key to the strategy, because as soon as you get those nailed down, it becomes a more convergent process. So in workshops, which may have 2 hours for a group to develop a roadmap, they may take half the time to establish that multifunctional group. And then I would always relax, because then they can just fill in all the bits and get there. So the right-hand side, it's systems thinking, I guess. You need to know the initial and final conditions. But we always start on the right, unless it's very incremental. And then with that right-hand side pinned down a bit at the various layers and perspectives, then you can say, well, where are we now and how good is it? Strengths and weaknesses with relation to that vision. And then the core component of the roadmap is the pathway, which may have branches and so on, that connects today to that vision. So those two boundary points in time are fundamental. I mean, time is an interesting thing. You pick up a strategy book and you find time in it. It's really odd. That it's a fundamental dimension, but most strategy models are static. Road mapping is inherently got time. It brings time to the party. And things like SWOT, most widely used and abused strategy tool. Where's the time dimension? Well, it's implicit. When you look at another tool like that, overlaid on the roadmap structure, it becomes very clear that the response time in the system, your ability to respond to signals, is delayed. If you've got a product in the warehouse, it might be a day. If you've got to develop a new graphene battery, it will be 15 years, right? The slope of the line. And SWOT has basically got a slope because it's current strengths and weaknesses with some understanding of your ability to respond to an external threat or opportunity.
Love it. So I've always kind of, anything's in a pest or a SWOT, I typically add on an extra layer of immediacy, when is it, and impact, that sort of thing. But yeah, I love that kind of concept of the timeliness. I've not phrased it that way.
That's how you can add time to all other tools and frameworks, in my experience, is that you insert the components of that tool or framework into the structure of the roadmap, add time. So the two benefits of that is you get the dynamic nature, so it's SWOT over time, and then also the broader system context. So most other tools focus on a particular part of the system. Like if you've got a competitive issue, Porter's Five Forces is a tool. That's one layer of this holistic roadmap. And I've never seen any incompatibility with any other tool. In fact, the function road mapping contributes to a toolkit is the knowledge integrator. Because it's designed to be very holistic. It's got the whole system, including the supply and demand sides. It's got all time, even the past. Very good learning tool. Every other tool focuses on removing question marks from that roadmap. In fact, the first iteration, I always say, it is an agile approach, really iterate fast to the learning process. You'll learn very quickly what you know and what you don't know. If somebody comes into, shows you a nice glossy strategy document, get a pair of scissors, cut it up, stick it on the roadmap, and you'll find all the holes. So it's a dumb tool. It's not analytically powerful, but it's very good at communication as a visual method, and superb at integration of knowledge because it's got the systems thinking behind it, and that's the function it brings. But no other tool can do the integration because there's no other tool that just has those dimensions.
I knew there was a good reason we were talking, Rob. That's gold dust. So we've kind of talked about some elements of it, some kind of contents and visuals, but maybe you can unpack that a little bit more. What's visually, what are we looking at on a roadmap?
Well, the most common practice is generally poor. Actually, it's as a visual tool, it's surprising that people often fail at that very last hurdle. They may have great content, but the human brain is really a visual processing system, right? And it really struggles to see through a bad visual to the good content and structure. And many people who create roadmaps don't even have any basic training on visual design. And you don't need much. But I think everyone should upskill a little bit because when you look at visuals, it's pretty poor on average. From a visual perspective, I think the way to approach it, the sort of multi-layered time-based view is not a very exciting visual, but it's very organized for information. And it's very suitable for developing strategy and implementing strategy. So communities, say technical communities, program managers really like that format. And even those ones can be made pretty and readable because if it's an ugly object, people won't engage with it. So it'll be well organized and a sort of interesting visual. But then what people usually forget to do is to say, well, people outside of that community, they need a more communication-oriented roadmap, the absolute critical messages. They take all the noise and detail out. It's really around the core pathway and the motivation. And so I think I would always encourage roadmaps in pairs of visuals, at least. One is the detail, which serves those communities' needs, but then start thinking about, well, look at the outside stakeholders. Say the board needs a roadmap. So you use all the detail from the structured roadmap and then create a visual that's tailored for that community. It may depend on the very individuals, or that if it's a finance director, they want to see the money emphasized. So that extra step is often not done, and I've seen great roadmaps fail at that point. So I just say whenever you're communicating outward to different stakeholders, you need to think carefully about the visual form. And it may not be a visual even, maybe it's a spreadsheet, for certain communities and so on. But that extra step is hardly ever done, and it should be because all that hard work can fail at that last point if people can't engage with the strategic narrative. So I see these more complicated roadmap forms, which are very useful, and then these very simplified forms. If you only work at the simplified level, it's superficial. So you have to get your hands dirty in the detail and then come up to the surface and then think about the pitch, if you like, the simple message. And those people who receive that sort of door opening with those simplified graphics will be very pleased to know there's detail. And if you want to respond to any query they have, it'll be in the detailed version. So working at those two levels, you may have multiple versions of the simplified ones, but that's a very good practice, but hardly ever done. So I'd encourage that. Maybe in software, it's not such a big deal because the core roadmap is often, about the core integrating the product release set and visual. They're not too complex. It's that style of roadmap that should be taken to the board, if you like.
We've got kind of the different layers of detail there. Can you maybe spell out a little bit more about what sort of detail? What are the elements that are in here?
Well, if you think about a corporate roadmap, they could have the whole corporate strategy on one page. Then what the systems thinking allows you to do is to have a hierarchical family of roadmaps to manage that complexity. And so if you think about each business unit will have their own roadmap, and they'll have one line in the corporate roadmap, and then within that business unit they'll have probably organized around product families of products because that's what generates the revenue, and they'll have a whole series of product roadmaps, and ideally that family of roadmaps will work together, so the information flows vertically in the organization as well. So you need to integrate or align horizontally. For example, if a product, is the marketing and technical groups on the same page? That's horizontal alignment in the organization. But vertical alignment or integration is a big problem too. I see a lot of problems of bottom up. It doesn't actually get into the corporate thinking. corporate thinking doesn't flow down. The roadmap, the systems architecture allows that all to happen. And then ultimately, you need to align and integrate at the right time, synchronization. So sitting behind all the roadmaps are those three fundamental dimensions: vertical communication in the system, horizontal, and in time, because that's the ultimate scarce resource. I think I've forgotten what your question was, but that's my answer.
And so you've mentioned using stickies. You've also mentioned using Excel. Do you have a preferred tool in terms of both creating but also managing and visualizing?
Well, I think the most common tools I see, and we use, are really simple office tools to start with anyway. So my advice generally is don't reach for software in the first instance. Start the conversation going with paper and post-it notes to get a feeling for the method and how it'll work for you and what the value is and how to customize it. It'll stabilize after a few iterations, and you'll be in a much better position to decide, what software support and digital support you need. And you have a use case that you could then go and test out different solutions, because there's a lot out there now. A lot of them are, subscription services, so you might get a month's free trial. But dashing to software straight off can be a big mistake, I think. So I really simple, widely available tools are the best ones. I've seen people in terms of visuals, they tend to often reach for Visio or other graphic packages that are better than PowerPoint. When one comes to dedicated software systems, I have seen some social media systems adapted. But I guess there's two strands. There's some software systems that have been around for a while that come out of the hardware world, decades. There's one from Sofian. They tend to often end up in product management systems. The one Accolade, it's called in their system. It's got all the architectural support. That's the key thing that many software systems won't have. So complex roadmaps, multiple roadmaps in a complex corporation. That has its origins in Motorola 20 or 30 years ago. It's gone through multiple ownerships. Sharp Cloud is one that came out 15 years ago. Fujitsu Services, working with the external vendor Sharp Cloud in the Futures group, needed that sort of system. And then more recently, Itonics in Germany. And there's only those three that are really fit for corporate deployment, if you like, in this hardware environment. But then last 5+ years, a whole host of agile road mapping systems have appeared. Many pages of Google, I think quite fast moving. Some of them, I think, can support the architectural thinking, the systems thinking. Many of them probably not. A lot of them look very slick, but I tend not to work with the software systems because we're always helping organizations get going. So it's before the moment when they probably are in a fit state to work out what IT support and software will work for them.
Fair enough. And so that sounds like the sticky is the preferred tool at the starting point.
Absolutely. And one of the benefits of COVID, maybe the only one, was everyone was forced into experimenting with digital tools. So, we got quite a bit of experience with digital whiteboards, and they're a fair emulation of the technique. It does allow distributed and remote collaboration, but some things are better face to face. So my thinking there is it's pretty good, but maybe if you had full design control, in other words, you could get people together if you want to, which is very expensive and logistically complex. Maybe in the new normal, you could reduce the requirement to do that by 75%, no problem. A lot of wasted time there. People have traveled around and you do probably things in workshops that aren't really value adding. So if you really think about when it's critical to get face-to-face meetings, maybe to kick off, to build trust, I think that conversation could be had very well in a continuous basis, digitally on whiteboards or other systems. And then maybe at particular points you get together again. So I think that's still people are trying to work out what the best solution, the mix, hybrid mix. What we don't tend to encourage is doing both at the same time. That's a recipe for disaster so far. Maybe in the future when we're really high fidelity VR, maybe there'll be other options.
So coming on from tools then, Rob, what about best practice on road mapping? If you had to kind of choose one or two things.
I'm a bit allergic to the concept best, which means there's only one. But good practice, and effective practice, many things. I do think, going back to the original Motorola paper that described their method from 1980, I think 87. They recognize the need to have a consultative, consensus building process. I think that's an absolute must. You've got to get people's fingerprints on it. I mean, it is a useful tool to get your own thinking in order, and I use it myself, but that serves my purpose. But in a complex situation when multiple people have to be involved, if you don't get them all involved, the roadmap will have little traction. Now, you can do that in many ways, interviews, but then you don't get the conversation. So at certain points, getting people together, and it's a very effective way of having strategic conversations. And I would always encourage people to actually use the structure and empower people, and you can have conversations on the canvas. And it's really helpful for everyone because they understand, where this point sits in the bigger picture. It's just very, very effective, and it cuts through a lot of the conflict and so on. So I think I would always encourage people to take a sort of people-oriented process. There can be lots of modeling and simulation and good data from that source as well. But in the end, it's those people who have to act, and getting they have an ownership of the process if they're involved in it. So that's the top one, I guess. Keep it simple. There's great temptation, especially amongst technologists, to put everything in there because they kind of like to see the detail. I think you should suppress. I've never enforced it, but you should have a kind of a bit budget, if you like. No more than 20 post-it notes for any roadmap, for example. I don't know if it's 30 or 20. I've never been harsh about that, but that's an auto-scaling thing, right? So if you think about the history of the universe, you can tell that in 20 or 30 big chapters. How you made breakfast, 20 or 30 small steps. And so, you need to basically reduce the content because it becomes a burden to update and it hides the core message. Put the detail elsewhere. The roadmap should be the highest level navigational tool. I remember General Motors 20 years ago had a corporate decluttering process. I think all organizations accrue bureaucracy. And every now and again, you need to slash and burn it. And they had a really ruthless process of getting rid of everything. Probably have it back by now in spades. But their roadmaps were beautifully simple. The 5 things nobody must ever forget. So I think that discipline of keeping it high level, having this navigational aid, there's a great temptation, and the opposite of best practice or good practice is to mistake the roadmap for your strategy. It's a window onto your strategy. And then if you mistake, it's easy to mistake the make because it looks like your strategy because that's a depiction of it. But then people will start saying, well, road mapping is hard. But actually, it's a wonderfully simple technique to help you with a hard problem, which is your strategic planning and dilemmas and so on.
Perfect. And you answered my next question already. So let's take you to, I think you mentioned someone before we started. Whose advice on road mapping do you listen to?
Well, the first advice I would always listen to is people who've done it in the industry. Right? And, road mapping and most other good things in management don't come from academics. They come from people solving problems. And that's where roadmap came from. It wasn't dreamt up by academics. It was people in tough strategic situations finding a way to do it. So I would always really respect people who've kind of walked the talk. Really. And that's where we learned, working with companies as well, to then take that learning. What we can add is time to reflect, look at variety, and so on. So that's the first group where road mapping came from. And companies are very keen on learning from each other. Nobody's interested in the content of their roadmap, but how do they organize? So there's no barriers. Even competitors will often talk about these things. They just won't show you the actual roadmap. In terms of experts, I think the they're not academics exactly, they're systems experts. One comes from the semiconductor world, Dr. Gert Muller. He's from Eindhoven, although he's teaching systems in Kongsberg in Norway. He worked at the Embedded Systems Institute. Eindhoven, ex-Philipstown, really steeped in semiconductors and systems thinking. That's one of the roots of road mapping, came from complex semiconductors. And, Moore's law has been sustained through the whole industry, collectively developing a sector-level roadmap. And so they really understand systems, and Gerrit is the go-to guy. He's got a great website called Gaudi. Never asked him why, but I think it's because it's never finished like the cathedral in Barcelona. But it's a lot of resources there. So if you search on Muller, Muller, Gaudi, you'll find that. The other sector where road mapping came from, and people really understand systems, is aerospace. And so there I'd point to Professor Ollie de Wek at MIT, who's spent 2 years at Airbus working in the CTO office on their road mapping system. So he doesn't just think about it, he does it. And when he went back to MIT, he's got courses there now and a new book. Ollie de Wek has got some courses on technology road mapping and a new book. So if you want this sort of hardcore technology analysis side of technology road mapping, that's the main resource available now. So those two. And then I think also there's other experts around, some academics who have more applied focus that are interesting to talk to. And places like Fraunhofer, Dr. Sven Schilft in Stuttgart. They do a lot of very applied research and a lot of expertise in road mapping.
I've employed a number of people from ex-Fraunhofer institutes over the years.
It's a great bit of infrastructure that's been persistently supported for 75 plus years. I wish we could have something like that in the UK.
I've also spent a lot of time at ASML.
Well, what a remarkable company. So Gerrit Muller used to work at ASML, and so we worked on their road mapping there.
So, Rob, coming towards the end of the conversation, if you had to distill your philosophy on road mapping down to 1 or 2 sentences, what would it be?
It's actually a quote from Gerrit Muller once that stuck in my mind, is think big, act small. People often fall in the trap. They can see the power of road mapping, say, to synchronize the whole organization. Well, that's downstream, right? Take the first step. In an hour, 2 hours a day, you can do a lot, and you're on a journey. And so, often if you employ a consultant, maybe all problems are big problems because you're selling hours. They may say it's going to take 6 months. I always advise people to give them a day. There's plenty of time to demonstrate the benefit of a technique, and then iteration and agile approach, scaling up as you build confidence. So that general agile approach is always good for complex and uncertain projects. And the other one is really the power of integration. That's uniquely a benefit of road mapping, and it's missing. The strangest thing about road mapping, it's been around for 60 plus years, and it's been entirely ignored by business schools through that entire period. You won't find it in any strategy book. I've never seen it. A couple do have modules on it, not researched. So many people who need to know about it don't. And so that's, I guess, my biggest plea is we need to somehow solve that problem and get awareness better. Because when people are interested in technique, where do they find credible information? The metaphor travels much faster than the discipline. And so, you can easily get struggle, or if they don't spend enough time just working out what is this thing and how best to use it. You can get many different views and so on. So I think I'd encourage people to do a little bit of due diligence always, to just inform themselves, experiment, don't commit until, it's low risk, because if it's only a day or so, what's the downside of having a go? But to do a little bit of Google research first to try to spot what the actual discipline of road mapping as opposed to all the other stuff you find. In fact, the background to that was, I think that in 2003, the Roadmap for Peace in the Middle East was published. And immediately I saw the word just exploded across newspapers. I've seen it in novels, and people love the idea. Strong metaphor. It sounds like you know where you're going, but the actual good content behind it is a little bit obscure because it's not in the mainstream business teaching and research program.
Is there anything about road mapping that I should have asked you that I didn't?
I don't really think so. I think we've covered most aspects come to mind.
Rob, it's been wonderful having you here today. Always like to give people just a last chance to give that pitch. So fire away.
Our main mission is to develop useful things that have impact, but to disseminate. And so I guess from a dissemination point of view, we put quite a bit of effort in. I've got a website of my own, which is designed for that purpose, cambridgeroadmapping.net. So if anyone wants to find out a bit more, and lots of templates there and pointers to different resources, I think I'm trying to build something as one place to go. We do other training and so on. And sometimes the best way is learn by doing. So we have a knowledge transfer company embedded in our division of engineering owned by the university, set up to support dissemination of research. And so that's available as well for very direct hands-on support from professional consultants. And their model is not normal consulting one, because they're purpose is to transfer. So often the most effective transfer is when the company does a lot of the work. And so, you can minimize hours and cost to maximize transfer. So we do quite a lot of that sort of work. But it's not there for the normal commercial purpose of consulting, although it does generate resources for research. It's there to make an impact from the research. So that's my pitch, I guess, is spread the word, and we'll try to help.
As always, just a reminder, please do like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and if you'd like to join us on the channel, please do either get in touch via the comments below or email us at info@talkingroadmaps.com. We'd love to have you here. Rob, it's been a pleasure having you here.
Great. Thanks very much for having me.